Part 11. Book quote reading from my ZenMind balcony. These two books, they are really so mind-opening, and they help me understand my own perception. This is the second part of this series, What is Autism Really? In this part I go into the so-called extrasensory, and Donna Williams as well as Olga Bogdashina write about this quite extensively in these two books, and that's wonderfully refreshing to have such a new or different perspective on autism. In relying on what I call the system of sensing, the realm of will which doesn't follow intention is drawn to that with which it resonates. In my teens, I lived in quite a dangerous and lonely state a lot of the time, and this caused me to visit non-physically people and places where I felt safe. I didn't do this with imagination. I didn't fantasize what I'd like to say or do. I simply found myself feeling physically in these places or with these people. I could not see myself there, and I did not interact with the people I'd been drawn to. Yet I did feel myself moving up the stairs to my friend's flat, through the front door and into the kitchen. I could sense the smell of the room and the noises in the room. I could hear and see as my friends moved about and went on with things. So, I feel when I dream, I sometimes remember having been to places or countries, being with people I do not know. And I think this might be the same. When you dream, you move out of your body and then you just travel. Some people say they have déjà vus. They think they have been there already. When they travel in the body in physical form to a country, they suddenly feel it's so familiar. So it might be they have visited this country, this place already when they were dreaming. Or sometimes we feel that a person is so familiar, and this might be also because we have met in dreamland. Two of the strangest experiences among these were one when I visited my friend, but found myself in a different house. I moved from room to room and found what felt like her room. When I saw her again, she told me she'd moved house, and I told her I knew. She was surprised at this, and asked how I described the house and the layout of the rooms, and my description had been precisely in accordance with where the family had moved. The other experience was after leaving a house I'd lived in for 2 years. In the 2 months before I left, I'd moved bedrooms and had stayed in one with a sliding door. After having left, I continued to dream that I was living in that house. About a year later, I saw the person who remained living there, who proclaimed I'd never left. I asked what this meant, and was told that for some time afterwards, every morning, around the time I'd usually get up, the door would slide itself open, It occurred to me then that what others called ghosts were possibly sometimes merely unintentional, out-of-body experiences. It occurred to me further that some of the entities having out-of-body experiences may have had no living bodies to return to, but perhaps didn't realize or accept this, thinking perhaps they were merely dreaming and couldn't wake up. Some have had these experiences in death before being brought back to life. Some have had this experience when in a coma or state of temporary unconsciousness. Occasionally, someone more usual just has them asleep and sometimes even awake. This mind versus will, intention versus resonance, interpretation versus sensing, appear versus be, is all strange language to most people. Yet, if what follows seems to the minds of some readers to be alien, then it is probably because I'm talking about experiences we have all had, and yet most left behind, before many can even remember. Back then, back in the beginning, in the time before mind, I was not my body, nor even considered my selfhood necessarily to exist there. There was me, and there was the thing others might have called my body, but there was no feeling that this thing belonged to me, and the concept that it was actually part of me was a very difficult one to grasp, in more than just theory. As far as I experienced, there was a thing stuck on me, encasing me, at times claustrophobically, and I couldn't physically leave it behind, no matter how fast I ran away from it, attacked it, or sought to shut out awareness of it. It is, at this point, useful to point out that here the term I is not the I of the mind, which is called the little I, but the I before the mind, a sort of I that is the will. My will learned to escape body very young, certainly before the age of 3. It remained where I left it, zombie-like, and I floated outside of it, not too far away. Sometimes my will was dragged back to it, via emotion and empathy at what was happening to it, and sometimes because its bodily needs created a sense of pressure to return, but mostly there was body and there was me, in the sense of me as will, not as mind. And we were separable, able to join forces or not. These are scary things for many people. There is much horror and mythology associated with out-of-body experiences, merging, and the idea of a spirit as separate from mind or body. Stories of ghosts, witches, vampires, telepathy, telekinesis, and, of course, madness are enough to make many people avoid thinking about where some of this mythology may have been derived from, and sense others, curious and often power-seeking, heading toward so-called psychics, mediums, and cults. Others seeking or fearing what they see as powers and either actually having no capacity for or refinement of these systems have succumbed to mental disturbance or so-called madness as they seek these things with mind and false self. And you see this in the New Age cult, as I call it, There are many such people who are actually ego-driven, talking about their abilities and whatnot, and it's always tainted with ego, and that's why I left the New Age cult for this reason, because it didn't feel right. It should be natural. In a world of Clive Barker and Stephen King novels, how can the mechanics of earlier systems be openly discussed in an atmosphere so tainted with superstition and issues of power, status, and false self? In discussing these things recently with a man for whom emergence out-of-body experiences and the system of sensing was still a fully functioning system about which he could talk fluently, I'd felt nervous that others would have heard such a discussion, and I warned him to explain how these things worked, not just recall the experience. Be careful, I told him, always tell the mechanics. People hear with Stephen King ears. The realms of resonance. Just as will could join the body or not, will could join with all sorts of other things. Will could sense the wall or the surface, texture, and density of material without looking at it with physical eyes, or touching it with physical hands, or tasting it with a physical tongue, or tapping it to hear its sound. It was as though some part of me, of my being, could see without my eyes, hear without my ears, touch without my hands, and feel bodily without my body making direct physical contact. It was as though I had two sets of senses, the physical ones and non-physical ones, which some people have termed shadow senses. Perhaps these non-physical senses were like a functioning neurological imprint of each of my physical senses, just as the brain has an imprint of each limb. Perhaps, just as some people experienced pain in phantom limbs after amputation, this imprint of the senses could work even in the absence of using my physical ones, but only so long as I had not developed reliance on those physical senses. Some people, blind from birth, have retained the use of a shadow sense. It is this shadow sense with which they can sometimes sense the boundaries of a room, even without reliance purely on sonics, the sudden entry of something new into it without hearing or smelling it, or a change in the feel of the room without being told. I have vague recollections of being able to sense the surfaces around me. I have a sketchy sense of having been able to sense the wall and changes in its structure, where some parts were more solid than others. I recall sensing this without looking or using touch. Changes such as where a door or a window broke up or changed the continuity. I recall a sort of resonance with matter, a kind of non-physical body mapping. Now that may sound crazy, if you never lived it or grew out of it before the system of sensing ever evolved in any complex way. For a lot of people, this will be in the heebie-jeebie pile along with spiritual healing and feeling the vibes. But if I was an alien, it would not be judged as crazy. Even if its foreignness would scare some people and fascinate others. It is certainly true that I've lived an alien life. I can remember losing myself in the wall when I was around 6 months old. I know I was around that age because I was still in a cot and I hadn't really started using my body with conscious control. I say losing myself because in becoming resonant with something else, you lose connection with your separateness to that thing. Suddenly, there is no you, and what had been you just becomes a tool, like a sponge through which the sensing or resonance is taken in. What is sensed is not taken in by the conscious mind, and there is no thought, and no reflection, no wonder and no curiosity. There is just a journey into whatever is being sensed, and an accumulation of what has been mapped out. What is mapped out is the feel of the experience, and it is mapped out as a series of uninterpreted patterns, and all variations in that first pattern. It is not thought about, and there is no conscious awareness going on. It is like living inside a light bulb, a vacuum. Thought continues, but it continues beyond the accessible grasp of the conscious mind, within the triggerable realm of unknown knowing. The pre-conscious mind. The question is, can those who outgrew this ever return to the state once they've achieved an ongoing, consistent and permanent grip on consciousness? Perhaps those who have a tentative hold on it, e.g. some people with sleep disorders, epilepsy or certain developmental disabilities, which may interrupt the capacity consistently and cohesively to interpret sensory experience, may be more likely to hold on to this system beyond infancy, even into adulthood, in spite of social structures which promote its progressive but speedy redundancy. Normal perceptions of the outside world are clouded by the verbal notions and concepts in terms of which people do their thinking. In autism, language development is qualitatively different. On the one hand, this makes their perception of the world more accurate and concept-less, and seems to allow better awareness and an extraordinary memory capability. On the other hand, it hinders their functioning in the normal linguistic environment. To understand the mind of a child or adult who is completely nonverbal, without oral, sign, or written language, you must leave the world of thinking in words. This can be quite challenging for many people. Our society functions through the spoken word. For the majority of people, words are their native language. It is difficult for them to step outside this very basic way of relating and imagine something else. Some neurotypicals, especially those with stronger creative sides, can do this. Other neurotypicals struggle immensely in understanding this concept. Language is typically defined as a system of symbols, words, and methods, rules, a combination of which is used by a section or group of people and serves as a means of communication and formulating and expressing thoughts. As we discussed earlier, language is one of the systems to reduce awareness and make functioning efficient. The linguistic systems are both beneficial, as language gives an access to the accumulated knowledge of previous generations and other people's experiences, and restrictive, as it reduces awareness by sidelining anything that is not expressed linguistically. That's from Autism and the Edge of the Known World, Sensitivities, Language and Constructed Reality by Olga Bogdashina. Possibility versus predictability. The tendency for the left hemisphere to deny discrepancies that do not fit its already generated schema of things. The right hemisphere, by contrast, is actively watching for discrepancies, more like a devil's advocate. These approaches are both needed, but pull in opposite directions. The right hemisphere is, in other words, more capable of a frame shift, and not surprisingly, the right frontal lobe is especially important for flexibility of thought. If it is the right hemisphere that is vigilant for whatever it is that exists out there, it alone can bring us something other than what we already know. The left hemisphere deals with what it knows, and therefore prioritizes the expected. Its process is predictive. It positively prefers what it knows. This makes it more efficient in routine situations, where things are predictable, but less efficient than the right, wherever the initial assumptions have to be revised, or when there is a need to distinguish old information from new material that may be consistent with it. It operates equally in the realm of attention to verbal information. In keeping with what we know of its priorities, the left hemisphere actively narrows its attentional focus to highly related words, while the right hemisphere activates a broader range of words. The left hemisphere operates focally, suppressing meanings that are not currently relevant. By contrast, the right hemisphere processes information in a non-focal manner, with widespread activation of related meanings. Because the right hemisphere makes infrequent or distantly related word meanings available, there is increased right hemisphere involvement when generating unusual or distantly related words or novel uses for objects. This may be one of many aspects that tend to associate the right hemisphere with a freer, more creative style. The right anterior temporal region is associated with making connections across distantly related information during comprehension, and the right posterior superior temporal sulcus may be selectively involved in verbal creativity. In the close situation, by contrast, the left hemisphere actively suppresses the right to exclude associations which are semantically only distantly related. Because the left hemisphere is drawn by its expectations the right hemisphere outperforms the left whenever prediction is difficult. That's from The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain, and The Making of the Western World by Ian McGilchrist. Language as filter. Worf considers that language, for all its importance in structuring the reality, is in some sense a superficial embroidery upon deeper processes of consciousness, which are necessary before any communication, signaling or symbolism whatsoever can occur. The way we break up the flux of experience into static objects is different in different languages. As soon as we project the linguistic patterns on the universe, we see them there, whether they correspond to reality or not. In his paper, A Linguistic Consideration of Thinking in Primitive Communities, Worf provides a very convincing argument that so-called primitive communities are, in fact, far from being inferior to civilized societies in their mental functioning, but rather show a higher and more complex level of rational thinking. At the end of the article, the author concludes that English compared to Hopi is like a bludgeon to a rapier. Primitive languages. Having studied the languages of the American Indians, which were often referred to as primitive, Worf discovered a seeming paradox. A primitive language is much better equipped than a sophisticated and well-developed one to deal with physical science. Some languages, Worf believes, are closer to reality. Their concepts are a more accurate reflection of the world we know. For example, when we look at a surface in ever-changing, undulating motions, we say, "See that wave," but a wave cannot exist by itself. Some languages do not have a word for a wave. They are closer to reality in this respect. Hopi say, "Walalata," plural waving occurs. Another example of more accurate scientific reflection of reality is in verbs without subjects that give a better understanding of certain aspects. For example, flash, occurred. The most striking feature of many autistic individuals' perception is that their senses are too open, and incoming information is not filtered or selected. All the stimuli are perceived simultaneously at the stage of sensation, without awareness of concepts. This is known as Gestalt perception, and seems to be caused by sensory gating deficit. Things are just patterns of sensory stimuli, not functional objects. Due to Gestalt perception, autistic children may exhibit delayed concept acquisition that in turn slows down the development of verbal language. During the conceptless period, they seem to have difficulty learning the conventional functions of objects around them. That is just how Huxley describes the conceptless Gestalt experience under the influence of mescaline. According to Huxley, mescaline is the active principle of peyote, a root of the plant which the Indians of Mexico and the American Southwest venerate as though it were a deity. According to Huxley, mescaline, unlike other drugs, is not addictive. Its effects will disappear after 8 or 10 hours, and there is no craving for it. Professor J.S. Slotkin who studied and participated in the rites of a Peotist congregation, testified that these fellow worshippers certainly were not drunk or stupefied. He described them as quiet, courteous, and considerate towards one another. Unlike those so-called low-functioning autistic individuals who never experience what it is like for normal people, Huxley actually knew the conventional conceptualized world and experienced the confusing conceptless state only for a few hours. For what seemed an immensely long time I gazed without knowing, even without wishing to know, what it was that confronted me. At any other time I would have seen a chair barred with alternate light and shade. Today the percept had swallowed up the concept. I was so completely absorbed in looking, so thunderstruck by what I actually saw, that I could not be aware of anything else. Similar experiences, though rare, can be achieved in a relaxed brain state. For example, consider the experience of an American scientist, C. King, who was waiting on a New Jersey railway platform. Suddenly, the entire aspect of the surroundings changed. The whole atmosphere seemed strangely vitalized, and abruptly the few other persons on the platform took on an appearance hardly more important or significant than that of the doorknobs at the entrance to the passengers' waiting room. But the most extraordinary alternation was that of the dun-colored bricks. They remained naturally dun-colored bricks, for there was no concomitant sensory illusion in the experience, but all at once they appeared to be tremendously alive. So I once, during work, on a platform, it was so loud, but I switched into such an altered state, and suddenly I was fulfilled with love. I even loved the pavement under my feet. It was so strange, but all I could feel was oneness, and everybody was equal. And I just smiled. I was just so fulfilled and happy, and nothing mattered. I didn't hear that noise anymore. There was that inner peace, inner calm and gratitude. It lasted for about an hour. And then I switched back, and it was a wonderful experience. I think it was triggered by a scent of incense, of all things, on a busy trainway station. I don't know where it came from, but you see, scent can go to the brain very quickly, and even that can make you switch to the right hemisphere and give you this inner peace. In Tibetan tradition, the process of self-cultivation is conceived, among other things, in terms of internal flows, currents or winds. One has to learn to control the flows. Prana in Sanskrit, lung in Tibetan, both encompassing cognitive, emotional, and volitional states. Through physical exercises and internal visualizations, what is often classified as psychiatric illness in Western medicine is seen in Tibetan medical practice as a lung imbalance. Much of the specifically religious imagery of Buddhism can be of relevance to some people with ASD. However, we can look at this phenomenon from a different perspective, as a form of nonverbal communication. Professor Josephson believes his research may provide an explanation for paranormal spookiness. If electrons can jump around the lab instantaneously, then surely it might be possible for one brain to tell another that it is seeing without using normal methods of communication. Freud defined telepathy as a primitive form of communication made dormant by a language. In other words, it is the ability mentally to communicate thoughts, emotions, words, or images silently to another person. Stillman compares it to meditation or prayer when people send spiritual communications to the higher power. We can get a better understanding of nonverbal communication proper if we study animals' communication, most of which is nonverbal. They do produce sounds of words, but only to warn about danger, attract a mate, frighten an enemy, or when in pain. However, animals' primary communication is nonverbal. In their book Emotional Maturity and Well-Being, Psychological Lessons of Facilitated Communication, Haskew and Donnellan put forward a possible explanation of why there are so many reports of telepathy among those who have mental disabilities in contrast to normal people, whose telepathic abilities are usually elusive. It may be that a sixth sense is present in all of us at birth, but as speech and locomotion develop, the need for it fades. Still, many people seem to retain vestigial psychic abilities, especially at times of accident or trauma, and there is much anecdotal scientific literature describing those. For people with impaired communication capabilities, the sixth sense may remain active and utilized. The speaking world is simply rediscovering it. I eventually assumed they must have been right. I must have been broken, deeply deluded, on the wrong planet. The thought that most people had cancer of the soul or had bought into a sort of social mass psychosis they called normality was just a symptom of how crazy I'd actually become. Williams, 1998, page 86. Is it any wonder that not many individuals have come out with their weird experiences? The prospect of being considered crazy, psychotic, or psychic is not very appealing. However, many parents do believe that their children are able to feel their emotional states, but for the same reason they are afraid to articulate their suspicions. Donna Williams, 1998. In a world which has learned to rely on the system of interpretation and either to deny or make redundant the system of sensing, it is unnaturally natural that people should have an unspoken consensus not to look beyond the surface and to believe and trust and live by the experience that what they see on the surface is all that there is. It is perhaps equally unnaturally natural that such people may be at once curious and threatened by challenging encounters with those for whom this is not their assumed reality. Williams, 1998, page 87. From this perspective, we can see that it is normal people who are disconnected offline from sensory emotional field typical for highly sensitive autistic individuals.
I started my research on sensory perceptual differences in autism more than 20 years ago, when my son with autism was born. At the time, people were not much interested in this because they thought that they are not blind or deaf, so they see and hear the world the way we do. I disagreed. I could see it from the very beginning that my son was with me in this physical world, but his perception of the world was so different. And when I started working with other children with autism, and now I work with adults with autism, I was sure that we have to understand what it is like for them to live with us. They see everything differently, they hear everything differently, and so on.
The researchers have put forward a hypothesis for autism, which they call the intense world syndrome. According to their hypothesis, all features of autism, social interaction impairments, communication and language problems, cognitive functioning, repetitive behaviors, and so forth, are rooted in the sensory overload experienced by individuals with autism. Autistic people perceive, feel, and remember too much. Faced with a bombarding, confusing, baffling, and often painful environment, autistic infants withdraw into their own world by shutting down their sensory systems. It is important to add, however, that an autistic state is not only about the autistic individual's intense world and their difficulty coping with it, it is also about their different interpretation of the world around them because of their lack of shared experiences and their consequent development of different cognitive and linguistic functions. It would be a more useful comparison to call this intensely perceived world a paralleled world, differently perceived, as it inevitably would be interpreted, understood, and acted on differently. Unlike normal people at the stage of sensation, many autistic individuals perceive everything without filtration and selection, and experience the difficulty of distinguishing between foreground and background sensory stimuli. This results in a paradoxical phenomenon. Sensory information is received in infinite detail and holistically at the same time, known as Gestalt perception, perception of the whole scene as a single entity with all the details perceived, not processed, simultaneously. Gestalt perception can account for both strengths and weaknesses in autistic people's perception. On the one hand, this amount of unselected information cannot be processed simultaneously and may lead to sensory information overload, fragmented perception, delayed processing, distortions, monoprocessing, peripheral perception, and so forth. Donna Williams describes how this feels from the inside. Without developing the capacity to filter out a large amount of incoming sensory information, our conscious minds would be confused and overwhelmed, our perception fragmented, our senses overloaded, and perhaps heightened as the mind focused even more intensely on what was coming in a futile attempt to combat the confusion, emotions, unprocessed, undefined, and all muddled, may terrify us. People, as a major source of ever-changing sensory input, may become a source of threatening overload we learn to seek to avoid. Hyperreactivity and hyperplasticity mean that mini-columns have a higher than normal capacity for processing information. Excessive processing of the sensory input in the microcircuits leads in turn to exaggerated perception, producing extremely intense images, sounds, smells, and so on. This sensory overload combined with inability to filter information causes autistic children to withdraw and miss the opportunity to develop shared conceptual understanding of the world. Excessive neuronal processing leads to hyperperception, hyperattention, and hypermemory. In this view, ASDs are disorders of hyperfunctionality as opposed to disorders of hypofunctionality, as is often assumed. Asked who I am, my reply is, I am a self in the becoming. All of us began in the sensory. From here we progressively move toward deeper levels of processing as we become better able to filter out information not specific to us. We become able to focus and choose instead of being drawn indiscriminately and without choice into purely sensory experiences with an absence of mind. Here we begin to experience not just life, but a sense of our own life. We begin to bring concepts to what we see, and those concepts become the filters which help us see the crowd instead of this person or this hand or that mouse moving, that help us to see the work of art instead of the pattern on the frame and the lines of the frame and the texture of the canvas and the colors here and there. Each fragment held pure, unmuddied from the wider context of the component parts of the whole. Sometimes overwhelmed by the weight of mind and existence, some voluntarily take a journey, intentionally or not, back to where they came from. Some indulging in drugs or alcohol to take them there. For some, biochemistry, mess-ups, and even the effects of aging can take them back there without choice. I've stood in the street and suddenly had the entire meaning of everything fall away, plunged headfirst back into the sensory, like falling into the Impressionist painting, the sound around me becoming a chaotic symphony. And in this state, I felt instant called to the first thing familiar or sensorily addictive. Pink streetlights used to do this, and in this state, I've then been so totally captured and enraptured by the effect of merging with certain pink streetlights that it would not have mattered if an oncoming car was headed for me at those moments. I had an express ticket to heaven and didn't care. I've stood in the railway station and lost track of its purpose, suddenly captured by the sense of symmetry, category, and line. Recently, having moved out of the sensory, I looked up at a huge overhead chandelier and remembered the drug-like addictive effect such an experience once had on me. When asked about it, I recalled experience like it as merging with God because I would resonate with the sensory nature of the object with such an absolute purity and loss of self that it was like an overwhelming passion into which you merge and become part of the beauty itself. It was the ultimate in belonging and company. The feeling was completely compelling and addictive, and by comparison, the call of the world of interpretation seemed pale, weak, insignificant, foreign, and of little reward. When we switch over into the right hemisphere, the world just becomes so beautiful. And it will cease all longing as you feel held. All is one. That's how I felt in Glastonbury, being touched by the goddess, Mother Earth. And of course you want to stay in this state forever, because it's so nourishing, so fulfilling. You finally feel at ease. There are no worries, no stress. Everything is as it is. It's pure bliss. And you do not want to be pulled out. Unfortunately, in our left hemisphere dominant world, the environment, school, parents, society, they want you to behave normal, but I wonder, what is normal actually? There has, in my view, been a tendency to discount and marginalize the importance of our embodied nature, as though it were something incidental about us, rather than essential to us. Our very thinking, never mind our feeling, is bound up with our embodied nature, and must be. And this needs to be acknowledged. So does the converse, that the material world is not wholly distinct from consciousness in some way, that remains elusive. Everything about the body, which in neuropsychological terms is more closely related to and mediated by the right hemisphere than the left, makes it a natural enemy of the left hemisphere, the hemisphere of ideal representation rather than embodied fact, of rationalism rather than intuition, of explicitness rather than the implicit, of what is static rather than what is moving, of what is fixed rather than what is changing. The left hemisphere prefers what it has itself made, and the ultimate rebuff to that is the body. It is the ultimate demonstration of the recalcitrance of reality, of its not being subject to our control. The left hemisphere's optimism is at odds with recognizing the inevitable transience of the body and its message that we are mortal. The body is messy, imprecise, limited, an object of scorn. Therefore, to the fastidiously abstracted left hemisphere, with its fantasies of human omnipotence, As Alan Corbin has argued, we have become more cerebral and retreated more and more from the senses, especially from smell, touch and taste, as if repelled by the body and sight. The coolest of the senses, and the one most capable of detachment, has come to dominate all. The left hemisphere's assault on our embodied nature is not just an assault on our bodies, but on the embodied nature of the world around us. Matter is what is recalcitrant to the will. The idea that the material world is not just a lump of resource, but reaches into every part of the realm of value, including the spiritual, that through our embodied nature we can commune with it, that there are responses and responsibilities that need to be respected, has largely been lost by the dominant culture. What is more, trauma will push us into the left brain hemisphere, the character 2, which is the fight and flight. On those rare occasions when I feel lost in the pain of my character 2, I find it harder to feel that connection, as if my emotional pain is actually blocking my ability to feel their presence. In this way, my character 2 is actually impeding the ability of my character 4, right hemisphere, to connect with that which is beyond this physical form. Feeling my character 2 emotions is neither bad nor wrong, but it's a huge waste of time and energy if I forget to enjoy and savor these deep emotions, even the painful ones, along the way. The danger inherent in the process is the potential arrogance of the left hemisphere, which may not allow the return. It may come to think of itself as all in all. The left hemisphere can play a vital, irreplaceable role if only it can be restored to its rightful place and allow itself to be readopted by the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere is a crucial part of the creative process. The unfolding of potential, becoming, is potential, and for being to emerge from becoming, it needs to be collapsed into the present. As the wave function collapses under observation, and Schrödinger's cat becomes either dead or alive, the terms on which we exist, but it needs nonetheless to hand its work back to the right hemisphere. It is only out of the unity of the vision and unity that a new unity comes. So unity melts with its opposite and yet becomes more itself. I don't think we know that in this society. We think we do, but do we? Who is me? Ultimately, we are more than how our senses work, more than what our brains do with what's coming in via our senses. Still, it is so easy to confuse self with the mechanics of perception or cognition. Our systems. Ultimately, the self existed before its separability from everything external to it all entities progressively considered other. Self existed before its various phases of relationship to body or mind, and its eventual identification of these. Self existed before the formation of expressed personality or the impact of environment. Self is essentially none and all of these things simultaneously, and yet is ultimately a greater force than all of the things with which self is identified. Systems, personality, environment, body. The system of sensing. When you view someone else, you do not generally view them purely as a collection of sensations, of sensory impressions. Most people bring mind to their experiences of each other. They interpret what they experience. Unless drunk or on drugs, most people interpret beyond the sensory. They do not perceive themselves as just in the company of fleshy, pliable, textured material with fibrous, stringy matter and moist, moving, spherical blobs occurring in various colors. Most people gloss over the sensory, unable to see directly the art of life itself, and perceive the literal, seeing flesh, hair, eyes, cohesively and collectively, forming what they know as human beings. We all have experienced moments when we aren't quite aware, or when we are too aware to handle the world, or moments when we aren't quite aware of the company we are in, or so overly aware of it that it gets hard to function. We all have had times when we've had hardly any awareness of our bodies, even been out of them, or felt so weighed down by them that we become hypercritical, eager to escape, tune out, disappear. We have all had times when we've lost the plot, the why, the what, or been distracted by the meta-reality inside our heads to the extent that we are suddenly jolted out of a daydream. So too have we all had moments when we have been so aware that we have taken things in almost overwhelming, extreme detail. It can happen that two people meet and each has a feeling they know each other, even though no getting to know has yet happened. You can walk into a house and strongly sense the feel of that house, regardless of how its decor attempts to create another quite different feeling or impression. You can listen to or watch someone and, regardless of their saying all the right words, making all the right moves, you may sense something that isn't on the surface and somehow doesn't fit. It can happen that you really believe that you ought to be in a certain place at a certain time, but find yourself caught up in all sorts of other directions which ultimately prove to have been the right ones in spite of logic to the contrary, as though some inner knowing had directed you. Yet this gets called coincidence or fate. These experiences bring the alternate worlds of appear and be face to face with one another and sometimes into collision. When this happens, most people do what they are trained to do, ignore any sense of the be, and rely on what appears, in other words, upon the learned system of interpretations. For those who can't ignore what they sense beyond appearances, this can be scary, exciting, confusing, alienating, and yet somehow familiar, even in the seeming foreignness of these experiences, as though these unusual or rare experiences came naturally long before such a time can even be remembered. Perhaps this feeling comes from a time before the mind, and the egotism which evolves from it has taken its contorting, sometimes strangulating, its hold on a free, undistorted inner self that we are each born with. Perhaps because this feeling comes from a time before mind, it can be stifled and denied, but it cannot be reasoned with on an intellectual level, and even if it gives up on what we come to call I, ultimately, sooner or later, it breaks through, even if it is suppressed to the last moment of life. It is not as the appear that we leave our bodies, it is as what we were when we entered them. It is as the be, which is the right hemisphere state of mind. Perhaps this feeling comes from a time before words, before thought, before interpretation, before competition, before reliance on the conscious mind, and before identity, in a time when all new experiences are equal in their worth, and there is as yet no discrimination and no established sense of boundaries or hierarchy. This is a time when, without boundaries or restriction, one is the whole world, and everything experienced of that world is an indistinguishable and resonant part of oneself, with no need to explore it as a separate entity. Again, what she describes here is also described by Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor in her book Whole Brain Living. Read that and you'll understand. And My Stroke of Insight, where she experienced a stroke of the left hemisphere, so her left hemisphere was shut down and she just experienced the right hemisphere. So what she called it is nirvana. And to some extent I have experienced that too. And I know this state of feeling one with everything. Everything is equal. And it's a beautiful state to be in. And it has no words. It's just be and smile and feel grateful for everything. You probably take it for granted that when you experience yourself, you can at the same time also experience the room you are in, the object you are holding, or the person you are with. Most people live in a world in which they can simultaneously experience self and other. Yet, at times, people lose track of where they are, or who they are with, or that they are even in company. At that moment, when you look up, embarrassed, to realize you'd started picking your nose without the awareness you weren't alone, you'd slipped out of gear, slipped into the mode of all self, no other. Everyone has had the experience of being so caught up in awareness of another person, a captivating object, an overwhelming surrounding that you can't remember what you thought or felt or why you were there. You'd slipped into the mode of all other no self. There are moments when you realize you were lost in a limbo, unaware of yourself or anything beyond yourself. This is the state of no self, no other. There are some people who live in these foreign realms of all self, no other, all other, no self, or no self, no other, or who are constantly jumping between one or the other of these states, but never reaching the simultaneous sense of self and other. Those who can't escape one or the other of these realms are sometimes thought crazy, backward, disturbed, loners, obnoxious, bores, or, if a little luckier, creative types. If they can't escape these realms, but have got a tourist visa, able to travel from one mode to another, they are considered anything from frightening to enlightened, from special to weird. We are all some of these things, some of the time. Only in degree it is different for these people. They are there, either most of the time or all of the time, moving in a social world which predominantly is not there. Those who live in these other realms, with or without visitors' visas, to the perceptual world most people share, are generally the people who have retained or mastered the system of sensing. This may have been the reality of some great abstract and impressionist artists, dancers and musicians for whom these things came naturally, without mental application of technique. Others, without being either comics or artists, may return to a place for a visit or extended holiday, voluntarily or involuntarily, and find it like a homecoming place of already established identity and self. Before mind was even a notion, before hierarchy and the discrimination born of it, there was will, the realm of selfless self. In the time before mind, there was no simultaneous sense of self and other, nor was there a sense of competition, nor was there the social people world experience of with. In the time before mind, there is a time even before the experience of, in front of, and later at. Even before the experience of all self, no other, all other, no self, where entity separateness is established and loneliness is born. Before all this was another time, a place of magic lost. When you experience something, you experience its damnness, you experience its boundaries, its separability and separateness from you. Its existence within those boundaries is not just about its appearance, its surface, its physical substance. It is about its beingness, its energy within those boundaries, beyond that appearance, that surface, the external experience of that physical substance. It is possible to experience an entity outside of oneself without taking account of its appearance, its surface, or its physical substance. It is possible to be experienced by another entity without it taking account of or experiencing your own appearance, surface or physical substance. The energy bound up in these physical forms can be experienced beyond them, not just when this energy gives up its form, as in death, but in life too. This energy can escape these boundaries and experience other energies beyond their boundaries, just as some can leave their own boundaries and experience yours. If there has ever been a sense of home, a sense of belonging, a sense of equality and harmony, it must be here, for the Be is the home we come into. The world was and the appear is about the home we learn to construct in its absence. And yet, for most people, the Be probably begins to be the scar the time they are born. Perhaps for some even sooner. In almost all people, it is gone by the time one seeks to control and limit sensation, when one begins to think, to formulate expression through words, to discriminate and form hierarchies of relative significance and personal significance, as one moves from the system of sensing into the system of interpretation. Perhaps these first experiences begin to fritter away like leaves scattered to the wind once interpretation begins and meaning starts to evolve, a sense of importance. Then interpretation becomes the road to what most people call normality, a learned and socially constructed road that humans assume sets them apart from animals. And yet, ironically, the lives of many people are then spent sensing, in greater or lesser proportions, that something is missing. Then they either consciously or unconsciously strive to stifle that missing, the conservative, divert attention from it, the ignorant, or search for that something for themselves and in themselves. That sense of belonging and oneness with the world, that sense of purity and equality and freedom, that stranger who somehow is already known without consciously getting to know. Perhaps, even more than this, there lie questions of God, of self, and the nature and meaning of what people call the reality that is life. What Jill Bolte Taylor calls the left thinking brain, character 1, is where most neurotypicals reside. And for high-functioning autistics, they can switch to this left thinking brain side, but it never comes natural. And the so-called low-functioning autistics, they never cross over. They always stay in the right hemisphere, which is the sensing, what Donna Williams just described. Character 1, left brain thinking. Our brain's left hemisphere is the primary tool we use to interact with the external world. On the morning of the stroke, those cells making up the network of my character 1 left thinking brain were swimming in a pool of blood that rendered them completely non-functional, besides losing a group of skill sets that were dependent on these brain cells to function, as I mentioned When my left thinking network went offline, a specific part of my personality, a character that I had known for decades as my ego self, also disappeared. When my character 1 left thinking cellular network was incapacitated, I could no longer identify the physical boundaries of where I began and where I ended. I have to say that even as a neuroanatomist, I had never been taught that.
But I've always found religion to be fascinating. Ideas such as how people act on their beliefs. Fundamentalists, yeah. Well, once again, I recommend a healthy dose of psilocybin mushrooms. 3 weeks ago, 2 of my friends and I went to a ranch in Fredericksburg, Texas, and took what Terence McKenna calls a heroic dose. 5 dried grams. Let me tell you, our third eye was squeegeed quite cleanly. Wow! And I'm glad they're against the law. Because you know what happened when I took them? I laid in a field of green grass for 4 hours going, my God, I love everything. The heavens parted, God looked down and rained gifts of forgiveness onto my being, healing me on every level, psychically, physically, emotionally. And I realized our true nature is spirit, not body, that we are eternal beings, and God's love is unconditional, and there's nothing we can ever do to change that. It is only our illusion that we are separate from God or that we are alone. In fact, the reality is we are one with God, and He loves us. Now, if that isn't a hazard to this country, you see my point. How are we going to keep building nuclear weapons? You know what I mean? What's going to happen to the arms industry when we realize we're all one? It's going to fuck up the economy. The economy that's fake anyway. Which would be a real bummer, you know. You can see why the government's cracking down on the idea of experiencing unconditional love. It's interesting. Isn't it interesting that 2 drugs that are legal, alcohol and cigarettes, 2 drugs that do absolutely nothing for you whatsoever, and drugs that grow naturally upon this planet, drugs that open your eyes up to make you realize how you're being fucked every day of your life, those drugs are against the law. Wow. Coincidence? I don't know. I'm sure their motives are pure. But, oh my God. Lift me up out of this illusion, Lord. Heal my perception that I may know only reality and only you. Stuff like that. I took mushrooms and went to Astro World, and I had a really bad time. You're a moron. They are sacred. Go to nature. Wants to be on the black dragon tripping. I would fucking be puking, man, about 50 yards with each hurl of the black dragon. Possessed dragon. I just think it's interesting to see how people act on their beliefs, you know what I mean? Because all your beliefs, they're just that. They're nothing. There's how you were taught and raised. That doesn't make them real. That's why I always recommend a psychedelic experience, because it does make you realize everything you learned is in fact just learned and not necessarily true.
Intelligence, which means to generate the divine within you. And then there is the Russian way, the art of soaring. The application of so-called magical techniques. In this book, the authors present a uniquely Russian system for developing one's inner potential and improving conditions in life. The fundamental principle is an understanding of the interconnection between the inner and outer worlds. Outer circumstances are reflections of our inner state, and by changing ourselves on the inside, the way we perceive and understand the world, we can positively alter the conditions. The world around us is mysterious and unpredictable. However many plans we make, it is impossible to foresee everything, all the more so in an enigmatic society like Russia, with its never-ending series of surprises. Perestroika, the Putsch, the Dry Law, the 17th of August, and so on. Over the years, we had ceased believing in miracles, but then miracles again came into our lives. In fact, they began occurring daily. Reading standard esoteric literature may give the impression that magic can only be carried out with the help of objects of power or by performing magical rites or spells. In our view, these are all secondary. The most important aspect of magic is that special state of being when you are charged with energy. In shamanism, this state is reached by entering into a trance, often achieved through ritual dance and playing musical instruments, like tambourines, drums, didgeridoos, flutes. Sometimes certain psychotropic substances are also utilized. In traditional magic, this state can be attained by observing a multitude of mysterious and unintelligible actions, rituals, whose details must be performed with strict exactness. Any deviation could put the magician in mortal peril. As a rule, rituals are accompanied by ancient and powerful incantations secretly passed down by word of mouth from master to student. In this book we propose a humorous, light-hearted approach to magic, based on an extraordinary state of being we call soaring. Entry into the state occurs by various means, for example by exaggerating problematic situations to outcomes which stretch the limits of absurdity, which cause the magician to laugh uproariously, or at least to smile, enabling the drama and seriousness of the issue to just fall away. It all becomes comical, and an unusual and creative way of embodying magic in life is revealed. The principal foundation of our approach requires a healthy sense of humor, boldness of thought and action, perhaps a child's game, and sometimes even a bit of mischief. Magic is no longer a complex science full of peril, but instead it becomes light, harmless, and fully accessible to all.
You have to ask, and things will just pop up like mad. And it's partly because your mind is a very strange thing. As soon as you give it a name, a genuine aim, it'll reconfigure the world in keeping with that aim. That's actually how you see to begin with. And so if you set it a task, especially, you have to be genuine about it, which is why you have to bring your thoughts and emotions together, and then you have to get them in your body so you're acting consistently. You have to be genuine about the aim, but once you aim, the world will reconfigure itself around that aim, which is very strange. And it's technically true. It
what you aim at determines the way the world manifests itself to you. And so if the world is manifesting itself in a very negative way, one thing to ask is, are you aiming at the right thing? Now, you know, I'm not trying to reduce everybody's problems to an improper aim. People get cut off at the knees for all sorts of reasons. You know, they get sick, they have accidents. There's a random element to being, that's for sure. And so you don't want to take anything, even that particular phrase, too far. You want to bind it with the fact that random things do happen to people, but it's still a great thing to ask.
I hope that through the course of the book, people will be led from this, I think, very simple-minded reductionist materialist way of thinking about everything to a view that there is a great deal more here than we can easily comprehend or perhaps ever comprehend, and that it is important to honor that and be aware of it, and that if we do, we help to bring more of something rather good into being. In other words, we carry a kind of moral responsibility for whatever it is that goes on in the cosmos, because we are not just in a passive way part of this creative cosmos, have been created, but also we are part of the process of creating what comes. So, in a way, far from our lives being pointless and worthless and meaningless, there is, if you like, a moral weight to our existence, which is to do our best to attend openly and without judgment to what is, to